He won an old barn in a card game. 5 widows were waiting with a hot meal on the table. The deed was still damp when Heck Purvis handed it across. He'd folded on a pair of 8s and gone white as a sheet, and I remember thinking a man shouldn't bet land he loves. But I'd already pushed in everything I had left, which wasn't much, $53 and a silver watch that ran slow, and Heck had called me anyway, and then I'd turned over 2 10s, and that was that. I walked out of the Meridian Saloon in Cotter's Fork, Wyoming, holding a piece of paper that said I owned a barn. Not a ranch, not a house, not 40 acres of good grass, a barn. The night was cold enough that my breath came out in a flag, and I stood under the porch eave reading that deed by the light of a window, and I could hear the piano still going inside. I'd been playing cards for 22 years, moved from town to town the way a leaf moves in a creek, not going anywhere in particular, just going, and I had won some things and lost more, and I was 54 years old and I owned a barn. I didn't know whether to laugh or sit down and put my head in my hands. I did neither. I folded the deed into my coat pocket and went to find my horse. The barn was 6 miles east of town, off a rutted track that climbed into a fold of hills before the land opened up into a broad, shallow valley. I found it in the dark, mostly by smell, hay, and old timber and something mineral in the soil, the particular cold, wet smell of a place where cattle have stood for years. The structure was sound enough, long, low, with a roof that needed work on the south end and 3 stalls that needed new boards at the floor. There was a loft. There was a well 60 feet back that still had water. There was a rusted iron stove in what had been a tack room. I picketed my horse and slept in the loft under 2 horse blankets. In the morning, I learned about the widows. There were 5 of them. This required some explaining, which came from a boy of about 12 who appeared on a mule before I'd finished my first cup of coffee, and who told me his name was Orrin Fitch, and that his mother, Cora Fitch, lived in the second house up the track. There was a cluster of 4 small houses and 1 larger one, strung along the north side of the valley, and that the Meridian spread had gone to pieces 2 years back after Walt Meridian died of a fever. And that the 5 women who lived in those houses were all of them connected to the old operation, one way or another. Walt's widow, Orrin said, ticking them off on his fingers with the precision of a boy who has explained this before. That's Mrs. Audra Meridian in the big house. Then there's my ma, she was Walt's cousin's wife. Then Mrs. Tillotson 2 houses down, she come out here as a cook 8 years back, and her husband Tom died in the flood of '79. Mrs. Rask, she's the tall one, her husband was the farrier. He got kicked in the temple by a green-broke gelding. And Miss Enid Chaffee in the last house, she was keeping Walt's books before he died and just stayed. He looked at me with a careful expression. They've been running this place themselves since Walt died, but the deed on the barn was his and it went in his debts, and now Heck Purvis had it, and now you got it. What's in the barn that matters to them? I said. Storage, the boy said. Tools, the good plow, seed corn for spring, and Mrs. Rask's horse is in there. She doesn't trust it anywhere else. I looked at my coffee, and then at the barn, and then at the boy. Tell them I'll be up presently. They were all 5 at the big house when I got there. That was Audra Meridian's house, the largest one, with a good porch and a kitchen that smelled like wood smoke and rendered fat and something with cinnamon in it. I knocked, and the door opened, and there they all were, more or less arranged as though they'd decided how to stand. Audra Meridian was probably 60, and had the manner of a woman who has run a household for 40 years, and considers it a sufficient qualification for most things. Mrs. Tillotson was younger and broader, and looked like she could lift a heifer. Mrs. Rask was indeed the tall one, nearly my height, with gray coming in at her temples, and a directness to her face that I found I liked immediately. Cora Fitch, Orrin's mother, was small and tired-looking in a way that wasn't weakness, more like a person who has spent a long time being quietly capable. And then Miss Enid Chaffee, who was maybe 45, with ink-stained fingers and a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles pushed up on her head. I took off my hat. Ladies, I said, my name is Cal Rourke. I appear to own your barn. I'm sorry about that. Audra Meridian looked at me for a moment and then said, Come in, Mr. Rourke. There's coffee and there are biscuits, and we'd like to talk to you about the situation. The situation, as they laid it out over the next hour, was this. They had been managing the valley on their own since Walt died, running the small herd of cattle that remained, keeping the kitchen gardens going, getting enough from the sale of beef and preserved goods to survive. The barn wasn't just storage, it was the hinge of the whole operation, the plow that lived in it, the hand tools, 60 bushels of seed corn they'd put by over 2 summers. And yes, Mrs. Rask's horse, which was a big gray gelding named Fort, and which she had nursed through colic twice, and would not board anywhere she didn't fully trust. They were not asking me to leave. They were not threatening or making demands. They laid out the facts the way people do when they've decided to trust you with the truth and see what you do with it. What they wanted, Audra Meridian said, was to buy the barn back. They could not pay me much, $60 maybe, if they put together what they had. They understood that wasn't fair market, but she wanted me to know the offer was genuine. I sat with that. I looked at my coffee cup. I looked at the 5 of them. I thought about Heck Purvis's face when he'd folded, the particular look of a man betting something he couldn't afford to lose. I don't want to sell the barn, I said. There was a silence. What I'm thinking, I said, is that I need somewhere to winter, and you seem to need someone who can do repair work. That roof on the south end is going to give you trouble before March, and those floor boards in the stalls, and I noticed the fence line along the east pasture is running low on posts in 3 places. I paused. I'm a fair hand with tools. I'm not much for cattle, but I can learn. Another silence, longer this time. You're proposing to stay, Mrs. Rask said. Proposing it, I said, not insisting. She looked at me steadily. She had gray eyes, the color of iron in flat light, and she was measuring something. I don't know what. Whatever it was, it seemed to take a while. Well, Audra Meridian said finally, that's not what I expected. No, I said, I don't suppose it is. I won't pretend the first weeks were simple. 5 women who have been managing on their own for 2 years don't immediately welcome a stranger into the machinery of it, and they shouldn't. I was slow about pushing myself in, and they were slow about making use of me, and for a while we circled each other politely. I started on the roof. That was a thing I could do without anyone's permission or guidance. I knew where the shingles were, and I had the tools, and I went up there on the first clear morning and worked until the light went. When I came down, Cora Fitch's boy Orrin was sitting on a fence rail watching me with the serious attention of a boy who has decided to learn something, and I let him hand me things and showed him how to feel for a bad shingle and how to set a nail flush. That's how most of those early days went. Work that needed doing, me doing it, Orrin watching. Mrs. Rask started talking to me at the end of the 2nd week. That's not quite right. She'd been civil before that. Good morning and evening, and yes, the frost came early. But she started actually talking at the end of the 2nd week, when she came out to the barn to check on Fort and found me replacing the bad boards in his stall and the horse standing next to me with his nose on my shoulder the way horses do when they've decided something. She stopped in the doorway. He doesn't usually take to strangers, she said. Doesn't seem like a stranger anymore, I said. She came in and ran her hand along Fort's neck and looked at the boards I'd put down. She crouched and tested them with her fingers. She stood back up. You do good work, she said. I've had plenty of time to get the basics right, I said. She leaned against the stall partition with her arms folded and looked at me directly the way she'd done that first morning at Audra's table. And I had the same feeling I'd had then, that she was measuring something and taking it seriously. Cora says you've been playing cards since you were 32, she said. More or less. That's a long time. It is. Did you like it? I had to think about that, which surprised me. Parts of it, I said. The part where you read people, the part where a good hand comes along, not the part where you're sleeping in a livery stable in February because you've lost everything again. I paused. Not that part much. She almost smiled, not quite. Did you ever have anything? Land, a house? Once, I said, long time back before my wife died. I hadn't said that out loud to anyone in a long time. I don't know why I said it then. The barn, maybe. The horse with his nose on my shoulder. Something about her standing there asking questions in a straightforward way without any softness in them that made me think the honest answer was the right one. She nodded slowly. She didn't say she was sorry. I respected that. Her name, she said. Anna, I said, fever 69. She was quiet for a moment. Mine was Jonah's, she said, the gelding 68. We stood there in the barn with the horse between us and the smell of fresh-cut pine from the new boards, and I thought. I won't try to say what I thought. Just that it was quiet and it was sufficient. Winter came hard in the 2nd month. The snow started on a Thursday and didn't stop until Sunday morning. We lost part of the fence on the east pasture to a downed cottonwood, and 2 of the cattle got loose in the night, and I spent 6 hours with Orrin and Mrs. Tillotson getting them back before the cold could do them real damage. Mrs. Tillotson was stronger than 2 men and made no complaint about any of it, and by the time we got back to the barn, I had a new opinion of her. The women rotated cooking. There was a loose system. Audra's big kitchen was the center, and they all ate together most evenings, and I had been taken into that without ceremony, which I understood was its own kind of acceptance. Enid Chaffee sat next to me at the table more than the others. She was the reader of the group, the one who'd kept Walt's books and still kept some set of accounts for the Valley operation, and she liked to talk about what she'd been reading. I didn't read as much as she did, but I wasn't ignorant, and we got on well. She had a quick way of talking and a dry humor, and I liked her. But it was Mrs. Rask, Nell Rask, as I eventually learned to call her, though it took a while, who was in my mind most of the time. I don't mean anything soft by that. It wasn't soft. It was more like paying attention to where she was in a room or a yard or a barn, noticing when she was troubled about something. Noticing when she was satisfied about something, which you could tell by a certain set of her shoulders. She didn't talk about herself easily, and I understood that and didn't push. But she asked me things. She had a habit of asking things in a direct way that assumed you'd tell her the truth, and I found that I did. One evening in January, she found me at the barn after supper. I went there most nights to check Fort and the other 2 horses, and she said without preamble, "Are you thinking about leaving in the spring?" I set down the lantern. The horses moved in the dark behind me. "I wasn't," I said, "until you asked. Now I'm thinking about it." She folded her arms. She was wearing her heavy coat and a wool scarf, and her boots were wet from the snow. The lantern light made her face complicated. "I'm asking because it matters for planning," she said. "The spring planting, whether we have," she paused, "whether we have the hands for it." "Is that why you're asking?" I said. She looked at me for a moment. "No," she said. That was all she said. But she held my eyes when she said it, and I understood what she meant. And I thought about everything that had brought me to this barn, the card game, Heck Purvis's white face, 22 years of moving and sleeping in strange places and waking up alone. And I thought that a person could accidentally land somewhere that fit. "I'm not thinking about leaving," I said. She nodded once, short and precise, like a woman who has gotten an answer she needed and is filing it away. Then she looked past me at Fort. "His left front shoe is loose," she said. "I saw it," I said. "I'll get it tomorrow." "I know you will," she said. She turned and walked back through the snow toward the houses, the lantern behind her and the dark in front of her, and I stood there in the barn doorway watching until she was inside. February was the hardest month. That's how winters go out here. You think you've gotten through the worst, and then February arrives with something personal about it. We had a week where the temperature dropped so low that the water in the trough froze overnight even with the barn door closed, and we had to break it every morning with an iron bar. The roof on Mrs. Tillotson's house started to sag under the snow load, and I spent 2 days up there in the worst of it, getting the weight off before something gave way. She brought me hot coffee and hardtack at midday both days and stood below calling up instructions and information about the roof's history that were both bossy and useful in equal measure. And when I came down the second evening, she said, "I didn't think you'd stick it." And I said, "I'm harder to discourage than I look." And she laughed, a real laugh, deep and sudden, and clapped me on the shoulder so hard I nearly dropped the coffee. Orrin had taken to following me most days. He was a serious boy, not given to chatter, but curious about everything I did and willing to work. I taught him things: how to set a proper fence post, how to read a horse's feet for trouble, how to judge when timber has gone soft inside without cutting into it. He listened the way smart boys listen, storing things away. His mother, Cora, watched all this from a careful distance and said nothing, which I understood as approval. One afternoon, Nell found me and Orrin mending the east fence line, and she stood watching for a while before she said, "He had a father until he was 6. "I know," I said. I'd learned Jonas Rask's story in pieces, not from Nell, who didn't offer it, but from the way the Valley talked about him in his absence. Good man, quick temper that he'd mostly mastered, proud of the boy. The gelding's kick had been sudden and nobody's fault, and that was perhaps the hardest part of it. "He's been without someone to show him things," Nell said. He's quick, I said. Whatever he decides to do, he'll do it well. She looked at the boy, who was wrestling a post-hole digger with great seriousness. He asked me last week if you were going to stay, she said. What did you tell him? I told him I didn't know, she paused. I didn't know then. Do you know now? I said. She kept her eyes on the boy, a long moment. I think so, she said. Spring came slowly, the way springs do when you've been waiting through a hard winter. First, just the smell of it, a loosening in the air, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes. The cattle were thin but alive. The seed corn was intact. The fence was in better shape than it had been in years, if I was honest. The 5 women sat together in Audra's kitchen one evening in March, and they laid out what the spring would need and what they had and what they lacked. And I sat at the end of the table, because by then I sat at the end of the table, and we went through it item by item. More seed. 2 new fence sections on the north side. Roof on the barn's south end still needed finishing. I'd done emergency work in the fall, but hadn't done it right. A second plow blade. They talked to me as a working part of it, not as a guest, not as a charity case, as the man who knew the fence line and the horses and the condition of the barn roof. I cannot tell you what that felt like after 22 years. I will try, but I'll probably fall short. It felt like being weighed and found to be what you actually are. The evening I'm really talking about, the one that stays with me, was a Wednesday in late March, maybe a week before real planting began. The snow was mostly off the valley floor. The light was staying longer. I'd spent the day finishing the south end of the barn roof, and I came down at dusk aching in my shoulders and hands, and Nell was in the barn checking on Fort, and she turned when she heard me come in. She looked at me for a long moment. I must have looked rough, 2 days of work on a roof in March wind, clothes stiff with it, probably a day's worth of grime on my face. She crossed the barn to me. She put her hand against the side of my face. Just her hand, flat and warm against my jaw. Not a grand gesture, just that. I was so tired I didn't move. I just stood there. Fort shifted in his stall, and one of the other horses blew out a long breath, and the lamp on the post threw its circle of yellow on the ground, and she looked at me the way you look at something you've decided about. You're the steadiest man I've known, she said, and I've known some steady men. I didn't have anything to say to that. I put my hand over hers where it was on my face, and we stood there in the barn in the cold and the lamplight until one of us moved, her, I think, stepping in. And I held her for a while, and she held me back, and the horses were still, and that was all. That was, I think, everything. I want to tell you something about winning, since the barn is where this story started. Won in a card game from a man who shouldn't have bet it. I have won things in my life, money, horses, once a very good saddle. I have also lost things, some of which I'll never fully account for. The barn I won from Heck Purvis was not the best hand I ever held, not by a long way. But I have thought about it, the strange luck of it, the way a thing you stumble into can turn out to be the ground you were looking for. By April, I was planting alongside Nell and Orrin and the others. By June, the east pasture was fenced right for the first time in years, and the cattle were moving through it, and I knew most of their individual dispositions and some of their histories. By August, Orrin had learned to drive a wagon team without supervision, and took it upon himself to teach me the geography of every draw and wash and seasonal creek in the valley, as though he was giving me a country. Nell and I do not make a show of things. We are not people who make a show, but she is beside me. That's the word for it. She is beside me in the mornings and in the evenings and in the long working days between, and the fact of her beside me, the particular weight of it, the way she turns to look at me sometimes when we're working and I catch it, that is something I did not know I was still capable of carrying. I was not a man anyone would have bet on. Back in Cotter's Fork on the night I walked out of the Meridian Saloon with a deed to a barn. I was not a man anyone would have looked at and thought, there is someone worth something. I'd spent 22 years being nobody's settled thing, just a man moving through, taking what the cards gave him, sleeping in borrowed places. But a good woman has her own eyes. And Nell Rask looked at me with hers and saw what I was, and she stayed. I kept the barn, by the way. It's in good repair now. The south roof has been solid through 2 winters. The seed corn comes in and goes out of it every year, and Fort stands in his stall and turns his nose toward the door when he hears my step, which he does every morning because I'm the one who feeds him now, and Nell says that's either a great compliment or a bribe, and she's probably right about that. I wake up here in this valley. In this life, next to this woman. That's what I won.